Hello and welcome to France 24 and a special edition this hour. Polls have just closed in Israel. Millions of people have been voting to choose the next parliament and, of course, the next prime minister. They have over 40 parties to choose from, with views from right across the political spectrum represented. Benjamin Netanyahu is hoping to secure a record fifth term, but allegations of corruption have dogged his campaign. Challenger Benny Gantz, a former general, is promising a cleaner politics. Well, late in the campaign, Netanyahu said that he would impose sovereignty on settlements in the West Bank. Gantz has remained vague on his plans for future relations with the Palestinians. He's argued for a separation. Well, according to the latest figures, turnout is down by about 1% compared with last year. But that breaks down. And just to tell you, we are looking at live images coming to us from Tel Aviv, from the headquarters of the Blue and White Alliance of Benny Gantz. It looks as though they are celebrating there, even though we don't quite have any exit poll results yet. Oh, we're just getting some results in right now. And according to Israeli media, Gantz's party has a 4-seat lead over Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party. That is according to two of the Israeli TV channels. They are saying that the Likud could win 36 seats. Another poll saying that the centrist Blue and White has 37 against Likud's 36. So as you can see, a great disparity between the results that we're getting here. But as you can see, they are celebrating there at the Blue and White Alliance, the party of Benny Gantz, the former general who is trying to unseat Benjamin Netanyahu, who is hoping to secure a fifth record term. And of course, this election has been described as a referendum on Benjamin Netanyahu. He has a series of corruption allegations hanging over his head and is likely to be indicted or could be indicted for those. Well, with me in the studio tonight, Raif Jabari, a professor at Sciences Po University and a specialist on the Arab world. Thank you for joining us. William Jordan is here, a former official from the US State Department, and our Middle East specialist, Sanam Chantier, with us throughout the programme as well. And just to, Sanam, turn to you first of all and break down those turnout figures, because turnout is crucial. It looks as though it is nationally about the same as the elections 4 years ago, but a big difference is that the Arab vote much lower, at around 44%.
I think the latest that I have, Laura, is actually 46%, and of course Israel has never seen such a decline in the Arab turnout, and frankly Arab citizens who represent some 20% of the population, they could have really swayed the vote if they wanted to, but we heard that many of them were saying we're boycotting this particular vote because we don't necessarily agree with, of course, the polarizing policies of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. In fact, they could have made sure that the Arab Israeli parties act as a potential, what we refer to as a kingmaker, so that they would have, we haven't had that really before, where they join a governing coalition in the country.
Even though the Arab parties have said that they would not work with either Benny Gantz or Benjamin Netanyahu, if it is close, if it is tight, it will be up to President Rivlin to ask every party who they would recommend, and they could well recommend Gantz over Netanyahu.
Indeed, and I think the observers that I've been speaking to today, I spoke to Henry Rim of the Eurasia Group, who was saying to me that this is what we're referring to as the first phase of this political process. What really is important, actually, is after the final results are announced, we see that the parties are going to be scrambling. They'll be cobbling to negotiate, to form the coalition groups. You've got on the one hand Gantz, who's gone after the more parties across the political spectrum, including the more centrist ones. And on the other hand, of course, Benjamin Netanyahu, most certainly with his recent pledge to annex the settlements in the West Bank, after the far right. So a very close eye after these final results are announced.
And let's not forget, even if Benny Gantz and his Blue and White Alliance gets more seats than Netanyahu's Likud, that does not mean he will be the next Prime Minister. As Salam points out, a lot of horse trading, a lot of negotiations to form a coalition. Whoever forms a government must have at least 61 seats in the 120-seat Knesset. So the latest exit polls we're getting show that it is very, very close between Gantz and Netanyahu. And Raif Jabari, would Benny Gantz bring anything different to Israeli politics, or is he, as his critics have said, just Netanyahu without the corruption allegations?
Well, I could not say what he will be doing after being elected, but he will be much better in regard to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in regard to the Arab-Israeli, and in regard of dividing the Israeli society. Who's not agreeing with him is a traitor. So it will be maybe he will be more appeasing the politics, because what we saw in the last couple of years, that Israel is facing 4 challenges: the occupation, the status of the Arab-Israeli, and the discriminatory speech against the Israeli Arab. Then the socio-economic divided of the nation, even though the economy is doing well, but there is an inequality. And the last things that is the challenge for Israel is how to compete with what the Zionism value of establishing a state and keeping the spiritual and egalitarian value with what the political parties, the extreme right, is doing today in Israel, is all the discourse about the Arab citizen, the minority, the relationship between the state and the religion. So these the questions are important.
Absolutely.
But he will be much better than what we saw in the last
You would find
years.
him preferable. I absolutely want to pick up on that point in just a moment. But first, we can go now to Tel Aviv. Catherine Norris-Trent is at the headquarters of Netanyahu's Likud party. And Catherine, we have got some exit polls coming in. And now I see that Benny Gantz is claiming victory already. What is the mood like where you are?
Well, a small cheer went up when the exit polls came out just on the top of the hour here, but it was a bit of a muted reaction, really. There are a few Likud politicians doing the rounds of the TV stations on the floor as we speak, saying that they are very pleased with these results, that they've increased their number of seats from 30 in the last elections, and the fact that they say it's extremely close between the two parties, and it will now come down to coalition building. They say they're confident they can build a ruling coalition and get over that 60 magic number of 60 or 61 to form a majority government in the Knesset. But that we'll have to wait and see in the hours to come. It's far from sure. We're going to have to look at the maths here and see what exactly the final numbers are, because we've got differences, of course, in the exit polls we've been seeing. It does seem very close indeed between the Likud party here and the Blue and White Alliance of Benny Gantz. But it's all about the coalition building. And now everyone here really is glued to their phones, waiting to see what the results will be, what the different parties will gather, and what that means in terms of the parliamentary and arithmetic for the Senate. Who can build a ruling coalition? People here in Likud certainly aren't ruling that out. They say they're confident they can do so.
Because, of course, the Likud can count on the support of the right-wing parties, the religious parties, the nationalist parties, Naftali Bennett's parties. But, of course, if those parties don't pass the threshold, they are wasted votes.
Absolutely, and it's been a very fine balancing act for Likud in the past few days, and Benjamin Netanyahu, and what kind of tone to strike on the election campaign. On the one hand, he's been wanting to galvanise his right-wing support and get them to turn out to the polling stations. So he's been saying he's very worried that the left, as he calls it, might gain power. He's also been warning about Arab voters again, saying he's worried there could be voter fraud. So he's been sparking all kinds of fears heading into the polls. But the danger for him with that strategy is that then he, galvanises the right-wing supporters too much, and that they all could flock to the Likud party, and therefore mean some of his right-wing coalition allies don't get past the magic 3.25% threshold, and therefore don't get any seats at all in the Knesset. And that would mean, if that some of those parties don't get through the threshold, that they just wouldn't be in parliament for him to form a coalition with, and that could hand victory to his rivals, to the Blue and White Alliance. So it's a very fine line indeed for Benjamin Netanyahu to tread. He'll be hoping he's got the calculation right.
Catherine, thank you very much indeed. Catherine Norris-Trent is there at the headquarters for the Likud. And as we've been saying, it is neck and neck, according to early exit polls. I must point out these are exit polls. This is not the final results by any means, but anything in the 30s would be favourable for Benjamin Netanyahu, who, as I say, has the support of all of those smaller right-wing parties. And William Jordan, he also has the support, doesn't he, of one US president?
Absolutely. Although to what extent Israelis, when they actually get into the polling places, take that into account, we'll find out presumably over the next hours and days, as the votes are counted. I'm not sure that everything that President Trump has so far said and done on behalf of Netanyahu has been enough to sort of tip things firmly in Netanyahu's favor. So if there was any idea either in Washington or in Jerusalem that somehow it was all going to hinge on whether or not Netanyahu had support from Trump, and that was enough to push it over the line, I don't think that was ever realistic, and I think we'll find that coming out over the next short while. Conversely, I think it's very important for Donald Trump, and he'll be watching these results closely, because he will want a strong, fortified Netanyahu in Israel come the campaign in 2020 to help him Trump in his re-election in the United States.
Raif Jabari.
You're
nodding your head there.
I think Trump helped a lot Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, in the election. What he did since 2017, Jerusalem, shifting the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, the High Golans, the last speech in the epic, and how he addressed Netanyahu as a strong prime minister, I think, and directly speaking to him, your prime minister, through the epic, it's a strong message to the electorate in Israel that Netanyahu is a strong government politician that he could deliver to the Israeli with external relation.
Well, and it's no secret, is it, that he went to Washington
yes.
Right before the election. Yes. Trump signed over sovereignty of the Golan Heights. Yes. Just yesterday, he recognised the Iranian elite military guards as a terrorist organisation. Yes. It's been one president after the other, hasn't it? That's
it. And I think he helped Netanyahu. But then, in politics, I hope that tonight we could see a different equation of what the U.S. president is trying to push the Middle East into. So a conflict, an escalation with the Palestinian, an escalation with the Arab Israelis. So instability inside Israel, but also instability outside Israel. And what we have been seeing since the last couple of years is a better relationship in the foreign. I mean, Netanyahu did well externally, to say, but internally did very bad. And he managed to create a good relationship with Brazil, with the Oman, Saudi Arabia. He made a good... Which was unthinkable just a few years ago. Yes. For Arab leaders to shake hands and sit in the same room as the Israeli Prime Minister. That's right. But then what he will be doing with his plans, the electoral plan now, and with the American deal that can be presented soon, is an escalation in the Palestinian side, I think. Division of the Israeli societies more, especially with a minority, will feel more targeted by the far left and the Likud, and then eventually it will be leading to a more isolation of the good elements in the Palestinian camp. So we are internally, it will be difficult for Israel to reconcile the contradiction, but also externally, and I think there will be an escalation with the Palestinian side, because I've been in the territories recently and in Israel, and I saw how much the settlement growing. There is like 150 settlement that's going to be annexed, and there is 102 outstanding post non-regular settlement that's also are supported by the government.
Netanyahu said he didn't make any distinction between the settlements built in Area C, as it's called, and those settlements built.
So he's bringing tension, and the Palestinians are looking to that. Okay, there is no a strong leadership in Palestine, but then you can't abuse with the Palestinian population because we might have the same problem of the first intifada. You could abuse with the policies, but at the end of the day, if Palestinians lose any hope, then why to negotiate? And this is not preparing any future in the region because, the Palestinian question is still a central question in the Arab countries. And this is why the Arab leaders did not receive Netanyahu, all the Arab leaders, some. I mean, the Oman Sultan Qaboos is not very strong. I mean, he's not a strong leader. He's in the end of his reign. He wants just to have a stability.
They're countries that follow Saudi Arabia's lead, essentially.
No.
Saudi Arabia did not really...
No, Saudi Arabia...
Not Oman.
But I mean, it's common knowledge, isn't it, that Saudi Arabia and Israel do have relations behind the scenes. It's not...
They have relations, but I mean, they can't publicly... show that they have a good relation with the Israeli, with Netanyahu, because it could create internal division. And actually, when I was in Oman at the time when Netanyahu went to Oman, and I've been speaking with Omanis, and they did not see it in a good, even though they could not criticize the Sultan Qaboos, but then they criticized receiving Netanyahu. So I think there is an important factor. Without solving the Palestinian issue, without solving the status of the Arab Israelis, without solving the relationship between the state and the religion in Israel, and these are crucial questions for the Israeli society and for the health and the development and the maintaining democratic Israel. Otherwise, you could not. I mean, it's a strong democracy where there is election, but the values are very important in democracy, and this is the question.
Values under threat. And Sanam, that's an interesting point Raif Jabari makes, isn't it? That Netanyahu has been very strong internationally. I don't think anyone could dispute that he has built solid alliances outside the country, but inside the country that might not have worked.
Certainly not, but I think I want to go back to a point that you made. I find you, Professor, overtly optimistic when it comes to what Benny Gantz can do with the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. But I think when it comes to, I want to go back to Iran because that's my area of speciality, something I've covered for over a decade. When it comes to both candidates, both Benny Gantz and Benjamin Netanyahu, they seem to be on the same page. We had Gantz at the Munich Security Conference not long ago say that Iran is an evil regime, that they're not daylights apart, the two candidates on this particular issue. And also looking back 2015 when Benny Gantz was initially the chief of staff under Netanyahu, he was already working on this quieter, low-profile campaign on Iranian targets in Syria, carrying the same policy as Netanyahu in terms of being cautious with Hezbollah. But I think where the two men actually differ, and this is something we haven't spoke about, is the Iran nuclear deal, because Bibi has accused Gantz of supporting the JCPOA, whereas he's actually offered a slightly more moderate view, more in line with Israel's security intelligence community at the time, saying that this is working, but of course it is flawed. Now, I do want to talk about Donald Trump. You spoke about this earlier, Laura, his decision to impose sanctions on Iran's Revolutionary Guards Corps. According to Iranians, according to a lot of observers, a lot of us that are watching Iran, this is a gift to Benjamin Netanyahu, because he did take that and in a tweet claim it as his own victory. So the support that
he literally said, I requested,
and this was Trump's response. So that support is incomparable. So,
but in Tehran, will they be hoping that Benny Gantz wins tonight?
Absolutely. In Tehran, the officials, especially the hardliners, we compare Iran's hardliners and the ultra-conservatives to the hawks in the United States. They're very much... not that they support any government in the US because they don't consider it to be a legitimate state, but they will be behind Gantz as opposed to Netanyahu.
Well, if I could just say, I think that you know Iran much better than I do. I actually think that the Iranian leadership will be just as happy with either of these Israeli leaders because they can spin it however they want in terms of, the world and with the United States behind, not the world, but with Israel, the United States, and the Sunni Arab countries in the region, continuing to mount this anti-Iran front across the board. And I think that as far as Trump and the relationship to the campaign that's just played out in Israel, the key thing is that Netanyahu does seem to have gained in terms of the Likud party getting more seats. He probably did get a marginal benefit from Trump support. But in the end, and despite everything that Professor Jabari has said, which I totally agree with, It's all not going to matter once it gets down to the nitty-gritty of the very, very insider baseball, as we say in the United States, politics that goes on in Israel. It will depend on how many of these fragmentary parties get enough seats in the Knesset, or get enough votes to get seats in the Knesset to matter, to allow Netanyahu to form the coalition. And that's ultimately what this is all about. The rest of this, we can go on and on forever, but it won't matter until one party or the other, one side or the other, puts together a coalition. And
actually, I think we can go back to Tel Aviv now, and Nadia Massi, who is at the headquarters for the Blue and White Alliance, Benny Gantz party. And Nadia, they seem to be celebrating there. What's going on?
Yeah, elation here at 10 o'clock local time when the exit polls were announced live on TV. People trickling out to the front of the stage, singing and chanting. They clearly believe Benny Gantz has done extremely well here. Now, there are 3 different exit polls that we're looking at tonight, but the one that was announced here in the room gives Benny Gantz's Blue and White Party 37 seats. This is an exit poll, a projection only, but that is far up from what polls were saying as late as Friday when the final polls were done before this vote. Now, so 37 for Benny Gantz and just 33 for Benjamin Netanyahu. And when you put when you put that together with the smaller parties that will be making up their coalitions, the predictions here in the room is that it will be 60-60. And you need here in Israel 61 seats for a governing majority in the Knesset. So this would be really a constitutional nightmare for coalition building. How will either party manage to get over the line? That is far from clear at this stage. If those numbers were to be borne out and this did end 60-60, who would the President Rivlin invite to try to form a government first? Because it is, of course, him who has that responsibility in the next couple of days to ask either Benny Gantz or Benjamin Netanyahu to try and form a party. But as I said, there's more than one exit poll going around tonight. The 2 other exit polls, the ones that weren't announced to this very jubilant room, suggest that Benjamin Netanyahu does have a clearer path than Benny Gantz towards being able to form a majority government. But it does appear that he may have eaten up some of the votes from those smaller far-right parties that he was hoping to be able to go into coalition with. So it seems that perhaps the 2 big parties have done well tonight, but the smaller parties, who everybody needs to form a coalition, will have to wait and see.
And we'll have to wait, Nadia, to see how the left-wing parties, Labour and Meretz, have done, of course.
Yeah, that's right. Particularly Labour were predicted to have done terribly in this election. I spoke to somebody from the Labour Party earlier who was saying they'd be happy if they just held the number of seats that they had in the past Knesset. One poll that I saw just a few minutes ago saying, though, the Labour Party have done, by their own standards, all right, getting some 7 seats. This is, again, just according to exit polls. Now, according to that same exit poll, a party that had been considered one of the kingmakers in this election, that's the Zehut Party, this kind of libertarian party that advocates a number of very strange points of view, from legalizing cannabis to also annexing lots of the West Bank, was thought to be a kingmaker, but according to this exit poll has not done enough to get over the 3.25% needed to actually gain their seats in the Knesset. So very much still to play for. We're looking at those numbers from Labour, looking at those numbers from Meretz, the far left party, and those will be the parties that Benny Gantz certainly needs if he is to try and form a coalition government.
All right, Nadia, for now, thank you very much indeed. Nadia Massi there is at the headquarters of the Blue and White Alliance, and as Nadia pointed out, very different exit polls. They're all saying very different things. One, Channel 12, says that Netanyahu's Likud has just 33 seats, whereas Benny Gantz's Blue and White Alliance has 37 seats, which would be a huge gain for the centrists. Another poll has them neck and neck on 36, and another one has 1 seat in it, but the right-wing bloc is stronger. So we are no clearer as to the final results at this time. These are all exit polls, and they're all saying very different things. Let's go back to Tel Aviv. Catherine Norris-Trent is at the Likud party headquarters. And Catherine, Benjamin Netanyahu is also claiming victory. Catherine, can you hear me?
Yes, sorry, Laura. The latest news we're hearing from Benjamin Netanyahu, despite the very contradictory exit polls we've been hearing, despite some of them showing a number of seats for the blue and white alliance of Benny Gantz, well, Benjamin Netanyahu remaining defiant, it seems. He says that the right-wing bloc led by Likud has won, I quote, a clear victory. He thanked the Israeli people for their confidence and says he looks forward to forming a right-wing government with Likud's natural partners tonight. So he clearly there is intent on continuing forward and trying to build a right-wing coalition. Now, we'll have to wait and see whether he's able to do so when the official results come through, because clearly there are contradictory exit polls, some of them showing very bad results indeed for some right-wing parties. Some of them, it seems, may not have got through the threshold of 3.25%, therefore gaining no seats in the Knesset. That would be bad news if that's confirmed for Benjamin Netanyahu, and would put his claims in doubt about whether he can form a coalition. But certainly he's holding on to the very last minute. He's not ready at all to concede defeat at the moment.
Yes, it is looking like really bad news for those right-wing parties that Benjamin Netanyahu desperately needs. We're hearing that the Zehut party, that's the Moshe Feiglin's identity party, has not even crossed the threshold, and nor has the new right party of Naftali Bennett and Ayelet Shaked. She, of course, is the justice minister. It looks as though they may not have got enough votes. That would make it very, very difficult for Netanyahu to form another government, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that party there, the new right bloc, as you were saying there, of Naftali Bennett, they took a political bet there in breaking away from a religious right party. They wanted to form a modern, secular right, hardline right party, and called for supporters to come and join them. And that had got some support, but the political picture is so complex here in Israel. So it's not just a question of centre, right and far right. There are religious and social questions thrown into the mix, which makes it quite a difficult picture, given also that it's a purely proportional representation political system. That means you have a large number of parties on the ballot sheet. So it makes it very difficult to predict which parties will do well. So it seems like Bennett and his partners there took a risk which didn't pay off. According to some exit polls, they have not passed the threshold and therefore will not gain any seats in the Knesset. So that's not only bad news for them if that's confirmed. Again, that's bad news for Benjamin Netanyahu, because that would have been a key coalition partner that he was counting on, one of the parties that he calls his natural alliance. So natural partners, excuse me. So we'll have to wait and see whether it's confirmed. They're going to be holding on here until the results are through. That could be in the early hours of the morning. Even tomorrow morning, we're going to be in for a late night here at Likud. Benjamin Netanyahu at the moment crossing his fingers, hoping he could hold on. One interesting thing that's been pointed out here as well is that some of the calculations, some of the projections going forward about the number of seats could point to a full-on draw, a dead heat with both the left and right blocs, perhaps putting together coalitions which have exactly 60 seats each. So where that takes Israel from here is very unclear. We could be in for weeks of horse trading negotiations, or even down in the future, more elections to try and clear this up.
All right, Catherine, thank you very much indeed. And just to bring you up to speed with what is happening, we are hearing that both Benjamin Netanyahu and Benny Gantz are claiming victory with some very disparate exit polls that have just come out, but some polls have them neck and neck. Some polls have Benny Gantz ahead. They're both claiming victory. A reminder, Israeli politics is very complicated. It uses a system of proportional representation. No party in the country's history has ever managed to get the 61 votes that it needs to form a government in the 120-seat Knesset. And that means the support of those smaller parties is crucial. Andrew Hillier has got a quick explainer for us.
In Israel, the name of the game is building a coalition. The Israeli parliament, the Knesset, has 120 seats. 61 are needed to form a government. But since the country's birth, no party has ever single-handedly won a majority of seats. This time, two blocs are certain to finish above the rest. They are Benjamin Netanyahu's right-wing Likud party and Benny Gantz's centrist Blue and White Alliance. But they'll have to cobble together the support of several smaller parties if they're to have a shot at forming a government. And it's not necessarily the candidate with the most seats who gets the first chance at forming a coalition. That opportunity goes to the candidate who receives the most recommendations from all of the parties that win seats. He or she then has up to 42 days to form a majority before Israel's president asks someone else. The country's political system means fringe figures often end up becoming kingmakers. This time, the Zehut Party's unexpectedly strong support could give it that role. The party's right-wing leader advocates legalising marijuana and annexing the occupied West Bank.
And actually that report was made just before these latest exit polls that we've been getting, which show, in fact, Moshe Feigelin's Zehut Party, who you saw at the end of that report, hasn't even crossed the threshold. And that is the big story tonight. What has happened to these smaller parties? I can tell you also that exit polls are putting the Labour Party, once a giant of Israeli politics, with their worst ever result, just 6 seats. They were polled to get between 8 and 10. It looks as though they've picked up just 6 seats. So the big parties are getting more than expected, and some of these smaller parties haven't even made it across the threshold. William Jordan, you were saying that this is somewhat reminiscent of what happened in Israel back in the 1980s, when you also had a kind of a hung parliament and they had to form this very unstable
National Unity Government. Yeah, they called it the NUG, the National Unity Government. It was between principally Labour and the Likud at the time. And it required the leaders of the two parties to trade off the top positions. It was, as I said, very unstable. It proved to be highly contradictory. There were a number of missed opportunities as far as advancing Arab-Israeli peace negotiations, because everything came around to the political maneuvering on the very Israeli level, local level. It was also a time when you had significant demographic changes starting in Israel, including the influx of increasing numbers of Jews from the Soviet Union, as well as Sephardi at the end of the 1980s. And that began to tip the balance. If you had a hung parliament situation now where you had to consider the possibility of a national unity government, the dynamics would be completely different. The center of gravity having shifted considerably in Israel towards the right, I think you can safely assume that a national unity government would form on the basis of, again, rather parochial Israeli issues, and probably adhere to some sort of position that would continue to favor or not favor moving ahead with the peace process, the idea of a two-state solution, but to take sort of these positions that are more in keeping with Likud and what are we now hearing is the blue and white tendency to stay very much to the right of the center of the political spectrum.
Well, exactly. Israeli politics, Raif Jabari, has moved very much to the right since then. Labour, as I say, used to be the dominant force when you had the peace process was going on. You had Israelis in the 1990s really willing to work with the Palestinians and try and come to some sort of peace process. We're a very different situation today, and that is partly down to how Israeli politics works, doesn't it? Because Netanyahu has become more and more dependent on the support of these smaller nationalist, religious, right-wing parties.
Yes, exactly. Netanyahu is dependent. His politics, when he came to the Likud, when he were leader of Likud, he posed his strategy on the support of the settlers, the religious parties, and more in a way, knowing that Netanyahu actually has supported, now he's supporting the extreme right parties in a way that these extreme right parties, the far right parties, are the one who supported, one of the parties is supporting the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. So I'll go back to the history. Yitzhak Rabin, he were a very tough as Gantz. He was a very tough general.
Right?
He was very tough. In the first Intifada, I was in the West Bank at that time, and I remember his speech about how he were breaking the hands,
we must break their arms, right?
Yes, and then how much he changed. So when I said Gantz maybe it would be better, I did not say he's the better, but he might be better because he's a general. He's in contact with the reality of the field, and then he could make deals. Generals in Israel. Israel is a state where it's based on security as a central issue, religious and the relation with the religion. And he could speak to the right, but to the left. And this is why I say he might be the good one, but I'm not saying he's the good one.
The reason that I said that I think I'm a little bit more sceptical than you are is because obviously I don't have the knowledge or experience that you have in the country, but the platform that he published was very similar to what we saw from Benjamin Netanyahu a decade ago in 2009 when he first came out supporting the status quo, building inside the settlement blocks as opposed to outside. That's why I think it's difficult to presume that he will be the better solution and he will be able to facilitate a peace process between the Israelis and Palestinians.
But he's not as
solution. There is no other solution, unfortunately.
But the right-wing parties have said they won't work with Benny Gantz. That's the difference.
Yes,
the right-wing
yes.
parties will work with Netanyahu, and then they will have a say in the government, and they will seek to drag the government more to the right.
He's not very clear on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, so there is...
no, he's very ambiguous, isn't he?
Yes, and that's good, actually. It gives him the maneuver to do something, because the status quo is the worst solution for both the Israeli, Palestinian and the region, but also for the world, because the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is there is a spin over in Europe, in everywhere. So I think sometimes if there is a third intifada, the problem will be extended to other in the region. So I think all the speech, all the discourse of Netanyahu and the right is working. Who's not agreeing with us is a traitor. It's more support for religious parties, more support for settlements, so more support for the extremists. And in the Israeli Democracy Institute, I was reading a polls. They say that the Israeli who support democracy is like 86%. The Israeli who support equal right for the Palestinian is 60%. Yeah, Arab Israelis
are largely secular people as well.
Yes.
They are not, as attached to the, the religious lands of what people call Judea and Samaria.
Yes.
They don't have that same connection. They just want a modern democratic state.
Exactly.
They want peace. They don't want their children to serve in the army and be at risk and all the rest of it.
Of course, but we have around 1 million settlers today in the West Bank, and
they are important votes.
And they
that
are
is
important vote, and they are influential. They bring important stories to the Israel because there is. They are well connected with the Israeli cities. They make in terms of urbanism. They are well connected and they are in contact and they are influential in the votes, but also in the relationship, the social and the economic factors. So. They are very important, and Netanyahu get his votes and the far right parties and all this discourse that is encouraged is to get the settler votes, and that is very essential. But also inside Israel, all the cities near Gaza, all the cities
the southern towns, exactly. Yes. It's interesting that Netanyahu portrays himself as the security candidate because actually, if you talk to people in the south, they are not voting for Netanyahu. They say he has not done anything about Hamas. 1,000 rockets fell on these southern communities. It only makes the headlines when a rocket goes as far as Tel Aviv, and they say they've been left to deal with it on their own. Their children are scared of the sound of the air raid.
Any reasonable person he follow up what is going on in between Israel and Palestine would see that Netanyahu policies in regard to the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem are leading to a deadlock. There could be no Palestinian state, but what is the solution? So annexing the settlement, that means creating an apartheid state. This is what Israel saw, closing including the settlement. Then there is, for the Palestinian from the West Bank, they will get like around 20% of the West Bank. So there will be a very difficult situation of Palestinian economy. There will be a kind of revolt of the Palestinian, and then eventually these politics will lead to more participation of the settlers in the Israeli politics. So
I think there's a little bit too much focus on this, because do we agree that there wasn't a great deal of this wasn't the pivot of Netanyahu's campaign from the outset, talking about the peace process or the settlements? It only came into the equation several days ago as part of various major interviews with TV networks in a bid to garner more support from the far right. So actually a lot of observers, again, I don't know whether either of you agrees with this, are saying that, perhaps he actually set the expectations a little too high, because he may actually have to deliver what the coalition would expect of him when it comes to the annexation of these settlements in the West Bank.
Well, my response to that is that I agree completely that a lot of this was brought in late. This had a lot to do with the trip to Washington. This had a lot to do with bringing President Trump into things directly. I think that, this election, let's face it, has been largely a referendum or a vote about Netanyahu and whether people believe that Netanyahu should continue to be prime minister, and whether or not Netanyahu, given his legal problems, deserves to stay on. I think that very late in the day, it's the wrong time to be getting into a full-throated discussion of the Arab-Israeli peace process, the question of Palestinians, and the nature of Israeli political society. Netanyahu has played throughout this campaign his divisive, high threat rhetoric, in terms of trying to rally his base and to play to the far right. But I agree completely. Where we are going to end up, however this turns out, and especially if we find suddenly, Benny Gantz as the new prime minister through some probably rather fragile coalition, as is the tendency in Israel, I'm not sure we're going to suddenly find a general who sees things differently and is going to take the country in a radically different direction. He is not in the same position that Yitzhak Rabin was in the early 1990s.
When the peace process was the number one agenda for
when
for
it
all
became the
Israelis.
number one agenda for a lot of reasons, including the fact that a secret process was begun that he had yielded efforts under Norwegian auspices. It was it was a moment that he had agreed in private to exploit in the context of significant American efforts after the 1991 defeat of Kuwait and the peace process that was launched then, the Madrid process. That in the face of a right-wing government, the Likud government at the time, that was absolutely determined to block almost every effort at making any progress on the Palestinian front in particular. When Rabin won, he decided to go in a different direction, but it was only because of the success of the secret negotiations with Arafat that you had the Oslo process, which the United States then got behind and worked significantly with the Israelis on. You don't have that moment, as far as anybody can tell right now. This is purely playing out on the Israeli political stage. So it is going to be a question of whether or not, this game plays out in the not so far right and the center right in terms of amassing a coalition that is enough to be able to jimmy Benjamin Netanyahu from the prime ministership. And only in that process will you then be able to set a new stage, possibly somewhere down the road, for Benny Gantz to present himself as the proponent of a new approach to dealing with the Palestinians, which will have a lot to do with how the Palestinians are.
And, the left-wing parties, the only parties that have spoken about the peace process throughout the campaign, Meretz and Labour, have polled very poorly, according to these exit polls. So they won't be having much of a say in the next government anyway. Let's go back to Tel Aviv. I think Catherine is with us. Nadia is with us. And Benny Gantz claiming victory, as is Benjamin Netanyahu. A very confusing situation, although in what might be a bit of a blow for Benny Gantz, the exit polls are saying that the left-wing parties have polled very poorly. Meretz and Labour have not done very well at all. About 10 seats between them, it looks like.
Yeah, polls are telling us a number of contradictory things this evening. Yes, some polls are showing that those left-wing parties haven't done as well as they were hoping to do, which would make it difficult for Benny Gantz to form a coalition government. But here in this room, they are still jubilant, people thinking that they have done enough to at least try and form a majority government. The exit polls that were being played here talk about a dead heat between the two biggest parties, the Blue and White Party and the Likud Party, 60-60 apiece. That leaving them each just one short of trying to form a majority government. Now, where does that leave that? What comes next? Well, that's a real constitutional nightmare for Israel. We could be looking possibly at a minority government in the form of a hung parliament. And in that case, who's the kingmaker here? And there is a possibility that's being floated around here tonight that actually the biggest Arab party in this election could help Benny Gantz should he try to form a minority government, because even though it is unlikely they'll formally join a coalition with Benny Gantz's party, the Arab parties have never done that in Israel's history, they may agree through a kind of confidence and supply deal to support legislation as it goes through Parliament. Now, the exit polls that I have here show the Arab parties on between 6 and 7 seats, which would be helpful for Benny Gantz as he tries to build what is likely to be an unstable coalition if he's trying to build a minority government. Now, if the Arab parties are to get on board with that, this is, of course, we're entering very much into the realm of ifs here, but if they are, there will be real questions about that nationality law that Benjamin Netanyahu passed, saying that Israel was a home for Jews and that Hebrew was the language of Israel. Now, Benny Gantz during the campaign didn't say that he was going to change any of that. He didn't plan to rip up that law, but he did say he might consider adding a line to it to say that this is a country of equality as well. So might that be enough for the Arab parties to get on board? We'll have to wait and see. Now, if none of that happens, another possibility is the two big parties, the Likud party and the Blue and White party, perhaps even coming together to form some kind of government of national unity in the event that there is no other way forward. Now, both parties have ruled that out thus far during election campaigning, but this is an extraordinary night in Israeli politics, and I think anything is possible.
Absolutely, and just more exit polls coming in, Nadia. The Kulanu party has, according to these polls, got 4 seats, so that's a party that would also be willing to work with Benny Gantz. I want to talk more about Benny Gantz as a potential Prime Minister, though. He has been accused of being very light on policy. In fact, he simply co-opted the manifesto of his coalition partner, Yair Lapid, who he intends to share the role of Prime Minister with if he gets into power. How has he countered that allegation, that criticism?
Well, yes, you're right. The critics say Benny Gantz is really trying to go through a supermarket of policies, picking up things left, right and centre to try and appeal to people across the political divide. And yes, they also say his political experience comes just in the form of Yair Lapid, who did serve as the finance minister previously. Benny Gantz himself, of course, has no political experience. He only formed his political party, Blue and White, back in February. He wasn't a politician at all 6 months ago. But he counters that, Benny Gantz, by saying, look, I'm a man of the military. He served as the chief of the Israeli army until 2015. I have a wide range, he says, of military experience, and I bring that political experience in the form of Yair Lapid. Now, he's also been saying that he is a man, perhaps his politics in some areas when it comes to security, for example, don't hugely differ from Benjamin Netanyahu, but what he says is different is corruption. He has really led this campaign by saying he'll bring clean governance to Israel. This, of course, in a context where Benjamin Netanyahu is really embroiled in a very serious series of corruption allegations that are so serious that if he is re-elected as Prime Minister, he may become the first Israeli leader to be indicted while in office. And if he loses, he may even go to prison. So Benny Gantz has really tried to hinge his campaign on that and say that he is a man who will bring good governance, clean governance to Israel.
All right, Nadia, thank you very much. Nadia Massi there at the headquarters of the Blue and White Party. And just to let you know what the exit polls are saying in Israel right now, one of them puts Benny Gantz right ahead with his party with 37 votes, with the Likud picking up just 33. Another poll has them both tied on 33. The big story, though, is the performance of these smaller parties. Netanyahu very dependent on these smaller right-wing parties. It looks as though Naftali Bennett and Ayelet Shaked's new right party hasn't made the threshold. That would be a surprise. The Zehut party The Libertarian Party, that whose leader wants to annex the West Bank and ask Palestinians to leave, seems to have not made it whatsoever. And the Arab parties, as you heard there, with 7 or 8 seats between them, and they could end up being the kingmakers if they agree to work with Benny Gantz. Let's go back over Netanyahu's problems, though. He's been dogged throughout this campaign by allegations of corruption. He insists he's innocent. He's called it a witch hunt. I think we can have a look. I think we can recap the corruption allegations that have been hanging over Benjamin Netanyahu in recent years. Let's take a look at that.
Bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. These words have weighed in on the campaign. Israel's general attorney said he plans to indict Benjamin Netanyahu on these charges over not 1, but 3 cases. Case 1000, cigars and pink champagne. Netanyahu is accused of having received gifts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, including cigars, champagne, and jewelry from Hollywood mogul Arnon Milchan and Australian billionaire James Packer. In return, the prime minister allegedly promoted an extension of tax cuts, which would have benefited Milchan. In the end, the finance ministry blocked the legislation. Netanyahu denies the gifts were bribes. Case 2000. Getting positive media coverage. The prime minister is accused of conspiring with Arnon Moses, the publisher of one of the largest dailies, to pass laws hampering a rival newspaper in exchange for positive coverage. Conversations have been recorded, yet Netanyahu has again denied wrongdoing and insists he was simply testing Moses. All along, the prime minister said the case is against him or empty.
I read the recommendation report, and I can say it's biased, extreme, and full of holes. Just like Swiss cheese.
Case 4000, the only one in which Netanyahu faces bribery charges on top of fraud and breach of trust. It involves Israel's biggest communication company, which owns news site Walla. Netanyahu was communication minister from 2014 to 2017. He is suspected of indirectly promoting legislation that would have favored Bezik and of allowing its owner, Shaul Alovich, to sell his other company, satellite network Yes, to Bezik several times its market value. All this allegedly for positive coverage on Walla.
And William Jordan, as we heard there, allegations of corruption have really been hanging around Netanyahu throughout his entire leadership.
Well, going back almost to the very start of his time as a senior Likud leader, I mean, and his first tenure as prime minister, I mean, there have been various allegations, either involving him directly or his family. I mean, his wife was implicated in a number of scandals early on. To my mind, I mean, the thing about corruption is that these charges are serious, and Israel has, sadly, a pretty serious history of other prime ministers having been brought down by corruption scandals, including I mean, most notably Ehud Olmert, but even Yitzhak Rabin, when he was prime minister, at times had to account for why he had an American bank account and things like that. I mean, the thing that's so remarkable about Netanyahu is that somehow, because he's done this very Trump-like pushing back aggressively, he's managed to turn this on his accusers in a way that has almost protected him from all of these different allegations. He might ultimately be brought down in the courts, but in a way, as I would put it, the allegations of corruption are sort of baked into Netanyahu and his image as far as the Israeli voters are concerned. So I don't think that the corruption scandals, bad as they might be, are currently going to be anything that hurts him. I think that his supporters are going to stick with him, and I think the right-wing parties, when they have to come together to possibly build a coalition with him, they're not going to be deterred by the corruption taint.
Let's go back to Tel Aviv very briefly before we go. Catherine's at the Likud headquarters. Catherine, what's the reaction there to these very mixed exit polls?
Well, officially, people from the Likud party are telling me they're still optimistic that exit polls have been wrong in the past and that they're confident they can put together a right-wing bloc and form a government. But I have to be said, there are quite a lot of long faces here. There is by no means a party atmosphere. There's by no means a big crowd. Senior politicians who we'd been hoping to see down here tell us that they're going to come later, but they're a bit late. So, clearly dragging their feet and waiting to see what comes of this very tight political race. And you can probably hear there is a bit of shouting here in the background. There is a small circle of supporters of Benjamin Netanyahu who are singing, shouting, waving Israeli flags and shouting, Bibi is the king of Israel. So they are trying to seem convinced at any rate. They're suddenly giving it quite a vocal performance, whether in that'll turn out to become concrete in terms of the actual numbers of votes for Likud and for his coalition allies or potential allies very much remains to be seen. It is a bit of a strange atmosphere here because as people from the Likud campaign are telling me, according to these exit polls, the number of seats they would have won would have gone up from 30 in 2015, but they could have perhaps almost been too successful and wiped out some of their right-wing potential allies. So, it's a bit of a mixed atmosphere here. They're trying to put a brave face on it, but it's not a party at all.
Well, quite. I mean, if visuals tell a story, Catherine, it looks like an empty hall behind you. It looks like people are packing up and going home. Very different to what we just saw at Benny Gantz's headquarters in the other part of town, where they're waving Israeli flags and jumping up and down. It is very reminiscent of what happened last time when you saw the Zionist Union headquarters. People were leaving and going home. It is really bad news for Netanyahu that these smaller parties, the Zehut, everyone's talked about how they're going to be a big force in this election. Some of them haven't even made the threshold.
Absolutely, that would be extremely bad news for Netanyahu if some of his right-wing allies, some of the far-right parties, the religious parties, haven't got over the threshold and therefore have no seats in parliament. Now, it's yet to be confirmed, of course, but we are hearing several exit polls that the new right party formed for this election by outgoing Education Minister Naftali Bennett and outgoing Minister Ayelet Sheked, may not have crossed the threshold and therefore has no seats. That would be a big blow for Netanyahu if it's confirmed.
Catherine, for now, thank you very much indeed. So has Netanyahu, King Bibi, as they call him, lost his crown? Well, according to these exit polls, it is not looking good for Netanyahu. Not final results by any means, though. One poll has them neck and neck. Another one has Benny Gantz just ahead, but it's all about the smaller parties. Some of these right-wing parties have not crossed the threshold. Professor Rafe Jabari, thank you very much to you. William Jordan, thank you to you. Son of Sentier, thanks as well. Thanks to you for watching. Do stay with us. Mark Owen up next. He'll have some more results for you and more reaction to the election in Israel. Don't go away.
As they mark the 25th anniversary of the genocide of the Tutsis, Rwanda and France are still trying to shed light on some of the murkier areas of the massacre of nearly 1 million people. Did the French government of the time close its eyes to the evidence? Did it allow some of the perpetrators to go free? Our reporters have been to meet witnesses and observers in an effort to understand what remains one of the worst genocides in history.
Reporters Plus on France 24 and France24.com.
Italy but died here in the Loire Valley. This week, France in Focus tells you all about the final years of visionary artist and inventor Leonardo da Vinci.
France in Focus, presented by Nadia Charby on France 24 and France24.com.
Bienvenue tous. Welcome to Live from Paris, world news and analysis from France 24. I'm Mark Owen. These are the headlines. Israel decides. Early exit polls say that Benny Gantz may have pulled off a surprise. His centrist Blue and White Alliance is predicted to have more seats than Benjamin Netanyahu's party. But the sitting Prime Minister is claiming a clear election victory for the right-wing bloc led by his party Likud. Basically, both men claiming they've won. Algeria has an interim president, but it's the man that the demonstrators have long been shouting that they don't want. They see Abdelkader Ben Salah as essentially an extension of the Bouteflika clan. The UN is warning that violence against civilians in Libya could be defined as war crimes. Michelle Bachelet is urging calm as the rebels of Khalifa Haftar are fighting their way to Tripoli. At least 47 have been killed. Collateral damage in a civil conflict for power. Thank you very much for being with us. You join us and we're focusing on the breaking news, the events unfolding in Israel, an election. It's in the throes of being resolved and there could be an upset on the cards. Benny Gantz is looking like having the most number of seats. Various polls are predicting his Blue and White Alliance is set to be the biggest party. But the Likud party leader, Benjamin Netanyahu, is seeking a fifth term as prime minister. He has had the public backing of US President Donald Trump, and that's considered to be a positive thing in Israeli circles. As it stands right now, both men are actually saying that they have won. I suppose it depends how you do the counting, and more importantly in Israeli politics, how you make the deals afterwards. Let's join Catherine Norris-Trent, who's at the Tel Aviv headquarters of the Likud party. Catherine, tell us about the mood there. Tell us what people are saying.
Well, the mood is rather subdued. They'd been hoping for a big party here tonight, but instead, well, there are some celebrations going on. It does feel a little bit forced. There are small groups of people chanting, "Bibi is the king of Israel," but some of the smiles are a bit drawn, it has to be said. Now, members of the Likud campaign say that despite these very tight exit polls, which could spell bad news for Benjamin Netanyahu, it's not confirmed yet. They like to point out that exit polls have been wrong in the past and that they still believe they have the numbers to start forming a government. So despite exit polls giving Benny Gantz's coalition, the alliance, rather the Blue and White Alliance, a lead in the number of seats, and despite those exit polls, some of them pointing to wipeouts for far-right parties who would be natural partners for Benjamin Netanyahu, he says he is going to start trying to form a coalition. He's thanked the Israeli people for their faith and says that the right-wing bloc has a clear victory. So clearly we're in for a long night here. It's very tight indeed, these results, and there could just be an upset on the cards here.
Catherine Norris-Trent, we're coming back to you very shortly for more. Stay across all developments for us. It is a nail-biter, as you say. So Catherine Norris-Trent there at the Likud party headquarters. We're hoping very shortly to go to the other side of Tel Aviv, to the Blue and White Alliance party headquarters. Before we join our reporter there, let's bring in our international affairs commentator, Douglas Herbert, here on the set. Douglas, I'm not quite sure how we expect this one to go, but clearly we sensed, I think, when you and I were talking earlier, there's little difference between Netanyahu and Gantz, and that appears to be how it's panning out.
What's remarkable about this election is actually Netanyahu did not have any ideological opposition. And as you know, it's been said and repeated time and again, this was an election that came down to the personalities of the candidates themselves. It was an election that really lacked substance by way of debates about policies. And believe me, Israeli society today, ask any Israeli, is there's hardly a lack of pressing social issues to talk about, from poverty issues, from infrastructure to education to health. What dominated this campaign on both sides, both of the blocks facing, the two main blocks facing off each other, whether we're talking Benjamin Netanyahu, whether we're talking Benny Gantz, is they both were almost obligated, but they were also inclined to put the emphasis and a very hard focus on security. Security, security, security. Now, obviously, security has always been the paramount issue in Israel. It's, to say the least, an understatement to say it's a complex geopolitical region, right? That's a no-brainer. But the degree to which, Mark, security trumped all in this election, and that Benny Gantz, although portrayed as, in a sense, the centrist bloc, his blue and white alliance being centrist, in the absence of a Netanyahu-type figure, he would have been considered, Benny Gantz, really not just right, but almost far to the right on a lot of his issues and the way he expressed them. And just to give you one indicator, there are also Arab parties, obviously, in Israel. They get a handful of seats in the elections in this parliament as well. Benny Gantz's alliance, the so-called moderate, the centrist bloc, he and his partner in this alliance did not even think. They ruled out the possibility of asking any of those Arab parties to potentially join a coalition if and when the occasion came for them to form something. So that really shows ideologically how close he was in many respects to Benjamin Netanyahu.
And indeed, it's the Israeli election, but of course Palestinians will be looking very closely to see what happens, because with Netanyahu making that statement a few days ago about he intended to annex the settlement land.
It's divisive politics, and it's a brand of politics that has worked marvelously from Benjamin Netanyahu in the past. We'll all remember the afternoon of Election Day back in 2015 when he talked about the so-called hordes of Arab voters that are being bussed to the polls by these NGO groups, these left-wing non-NGO groups. It was a warning, and it apparently worked. It was a last-minute scare tactic that brought those right-wingers out of their easy chairs, maybe who weren't going to vote because they figured he was a shoo-in anyway. He got elected, and we saw echoes of that same strategy again, not least of which, obviously, with his comments about the annexation, possibly annexing whole swathes of the West Bank. All of that, once again, to mobilize that far right and that right-wing electorate at the last minute. Whether he backs off afterwards, that's another question. But it's worked in the actual hue and cry of the campaign, in the throes of the endgame of the campaign.
Douglas, thank you. That word annexation has some really seriously nasty undertones, doesn't it? But let's not dwell on that too much right now, that we will analyse what it means and what it could mean for the Palestinian population as well, because clearly they're watching very closely what happens in this election. Just to remind you, Benjamin Netanyahu and Benny Gantz both claiming victory in the election in Israel. Douglas Herbert here in the studio. We have another guest who's with us, Jean-Pierre Filiou from Sciences Po. We'll come to you in a moment, sir, to get your points of view. First, let's go to Nadia Massi, who is at the headquarters of the Blue and White Alliance, basically Benny Gantz's party. And Nadia, tell us what the mood is there. What are people saying around you?
Well, Mark, when those exit polls were announced at 10 p.m. local time, this room erupted. There were celebrations going on for a good 40 minutes. The stage behind me is now set for Benny Gantz to come and speak relatively shortly. And he is, presumably now behind the scenes, making phone calls, trying to find a way to build what is looking likely to be a very fragile coalition if he can get there at all. The exit polls, as you know, tonight telling us different things. Some polls saying there's a dead heat between Likud and Benny Gantz's Blue and White Party. Their coalition's giving them 60-60 each. That is really unprecedented in Israeli history. You need 61 seats. That's how close they are to get a governing majority here. So both Benjamin Netanyahu and Benny Gantz will be working the phones tonight, trying to appeal to some of those smaller parties to get them on board, to get them over the line towards a majority. Now, who might Benny Gantz be trying to reach out to tonight? Well, we expect him to have the support of the Labour Party and of Meretz. They're the two parties of the left. We don't know precisely how well it is that they've done, but we're hearing that Meretz, that's slightly further to the left party, hasn't done very well at all, so perhaps not that useful for Benny Gantz. There is then also Kulanu. Now, that's a centrist party. They were with Netanyahu in the previous coalition, but could they flip now and join Benny Gantz? Maybe. What can he offer them? Let's see. The Arab parties, now that's a big one. The Arab parties split themselves into two small parties in this election, meaning that we thought that their vote would be diminished. But actually, they could be very important here. The prediction here is that at least one of those Arab parties has won about 6 seats. And while it is unlikely that Arab parties would agree to go into a formal coalition with Benny Gantz, in fact, Benny Gantz himself has also ruled that out, what we may see is Arab parties agreeing to follow Benny Gantz, back Benny Gantz in some kind of minority government were there to be a hung parliament here in Israel. That means Arab parties would support legislation that's put through the Knesset by Benny Gantz but wouldn't formally be in a coalition. That would also be extraordinary, giving Arab parties a huge amount of influence in Israeli politics going forward. And then what about the Orthodox Jewish parties? Historically, they've always sided with Benjamin Netanyahu, but could Benny Gantz try to flip them tonight? Well, he's going to try, but frankly, that's going to be quite hard for him because we know that Benny Gantz's ally in this race is Yair Lapid. Now, he's a man who's really detested by Orthodox parties because in the past, Yair Lapid forced Orthodox Jews to join Israeli military service, something that they're long against. So it's a complicated picture tonight. Lots of small parties to keep our eye on, but we'll be watching very closely, listening in and waiting as well for Benny Gantz to speak at that stage just behind me.
Nadia, for now, thank you very much indeed. We're expected to cross back to Nadia and Catherine throughout this programme to really take the temperature of what's being said at both the Likud and Blue and White Alliance headquarters there in Israel, where the news is, it seems like it's a dead heat. Or both candidates are claiming victory. Netanyahu says he's won and the right-wing alliance, but it seems that Gantz may have won the most number of seats. We're waiting to see how this is all going to shake down with proportional representation. The art of the deal, very much key in what happens next. Let's bring in our next guest to analyse the situation. Jean-Pierre Philippe's Professor of Middle East Contemporary History at Sciences Po. Sir, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
What is your initial reaction to what you've been hearing?
Well, no surprise. Everybody
Seriously?
knew that at this moment of the night, nobody would know the truth of what would be the next Knesset. It's a parliamentary elections, and the question of this party, of that party arriving first is not the main issue. As it has been said repeatedly, it's about coalition. But again, the control freak that is ruling Israel since for the past decade, named Netanyahu, you can see it in front of your eyes. Likud militants are not even allowed to enter the headquarters of Likud because he knew that there was a possibility of bad news when the first figures would be broadcast. So it's not only at this very moment that they're allowed to enter, and they have been all briefed by Big Brother Bibi, because that the nickname is supporters are giving him with respect and affection. So on the other side, some kind of the 20th century, overjoy reaction in the blue and white, and on the other, and you said for the other side that the two headquarters are 200 meters away from each other, but they are living in different planets, And I
was talking to the political side, rather.
No,
than
I'm sure you were.
I take your point completely.
Yes, because we're talking about a little country with a limited population, but at the same time, some kind of laboratory for what is democracy in the 21st century. And in that, Netanyahu was certainly a groundbreaker, not for positive reason. And I will only stress one point. I won't even talk about corruption and finance and all that.
Jean-Pierre, you can talk about anything you wish, sir.
No, social networks, social networks. The nice, cool, peacenik social networks, Netanyahu decided to make his whole campaign on social networks. He never appeared on TV, press, radio, and he had the press your colleagues in Israel booed and shout out during his meetings, calling names at them. So, and at the same time, he has 5 million followers on his different accounts. I know it because I just published a book about him, and I'm, of course, on all his accounts. And I got this whole, wave of message and some kind of bots. And Gantz was just, running behind him and trying to stay alive in the race to, social network have this tendency to burn down the content, the message in favor of the medium. And this campaign was all about it. And the very fact that tonight nobody is clearly a winner is a good news. Because when you're a fighter like Netanyahu saying, I'm the one, I'm the one, I'm the one, the fact that he cannot claim victory that clearly is good news, certainly. But 96, his first election, until the middle of the night, Perez had won. And even the New York Times had its headline on the defeat of Netanyahu. In the very morning, Netanyahu was the one who became prime minister. So this man is not only fighting until the last second of the last minute, of the last hour, of the last day of the campaign. Today he was chatting on Facebook with his fans because he knows that in Israel the electoral law doesn't forbid any kind of campaigning on social network, even on election day. And he made it very clear during his time as a prime minister that nobody would pass legislation or even rules about how to use social networks in the political arena. This is a message from Israel to the rest of the democratic world. This is what an electoral campaign could become if social networks would prevail.
Fascinating stuff. Jean-Pierre Filiou from Sciences Po, Middle East Contemporary History Professor. And as we heard, so much more besides. I can't wait to read your book, sir. Thank you for coming in and sharing your analysis with us. And that takes us very neatly on to discuss even more issues about this Israeli election. Jean-Pierre, thank you very much for joining us. Doug, I'll bring you back in to reflect on a little bit on what Jean-Pierre was saying there. And I'm kind of hearing parallels, spectacular parallels with Donald Trump.
You can almost graft them onto one another, right, Mark? Not just, seriously, I don't know who stole the playbook, the political playbook from whom, but, especially you could say Benjamin Netanyahu is to Facebook what Donald Trump is to Twitter. Both very savvy use, using it as populist pulpits, so to speak, really to get right over the heads of the so-called media establishment, the journalists, that they both are very, very much prone to bashing endlessly, denigrating journalists.
And as Jean-Pierre was saying,
our own journalists on the ground. Journalists are, he hasn't used the term the same way Donald Trump has, but enemies of the people, essentially. Netanyahu has gone after journalists, blames a liberal elitist media in cahoots with Jewish leftists and liberals for basically all of his legal and judicial woes, the corruption cases against him. But beyond just bashing journalists, I mean, there are other pages. You remember in the recent election campaign, the Muslim caravan in the U.S., Donald Trump, all of a sudden this, magical Muslim caravan, coming, hordes of Muslims coming towards the U.S. border. It was an clear and present danger to U.S. national security. We didn't really hear about it at all after the election, or very, very little. It all of a sudden sort of faded away, or very nearly. But the Arab bashing, bashing of all opponents, these are all tactics that both of these men, they're kindred spirits, Donald Trump, and they're both fans of each other and very hard allies. Donald Trump gave a lot of gifts to Netanyahu in this campaign. We could talk about that, I guess, later on.
Some might call it American interference in the Israeli election. Exactly. I think some observers
have called it that.
Indeed. Douglas, thank you. We'll be discussing more about Netanyahu and, of course, Benny Gantz as we go through this live from Paris programme to Beyond Midnight Paris time. Doug, thank you. Joining us now from a business angle, as ever, Kate Moody. How are you?
I'm well, Mark.
What have you got to tell us?
Well, we're looking at the role of the Israeli economy in this series of elections because, of course, issues of security and corruption are top priorities for voters, but the economy is playing a role as well here, Mark. The cost of living in Israel is relatively high, and although broad economic data are strong, inequality is rampant. Now, as you can see here, over the past decade or so, under Benjamin Netanyahu, the economy has had a rocky stretch, but recovered fairly well, growing about 3.3% last year. Forecasts for the coming years, as for the rest of the global economy, are slightly weaker. Now, among the most successful industries is the high-tech startup sector, which has boomed. The Blue Star Israel Technology Index is up 20% this year. That's a stronger pace even than America's tech companies. Overall, the sector employs about 10% of Israel's workforce. Now, the unemployment rate has hovered around 4% for years. The benefits, though, are not equally distributed. Israel has a large gap between rich and poor and the highest poverty rate among OECD developed nations, about a quarter of the population living below or near the poverty line. Those statistics are significantly higher among Israel's ultra-Orthodox and Arab populations. Almost half of Palestinian citizens of Israel live in poverty. The European Union and China have agreed to strengthen their trading relationship, describing it as a breakthrough. The joint statement issued in Brussels comes as both sides aim criticisms directly at the Trump administration. Washington this week threatened to impose fresh sanctions on European products. Delano D'Souza has the details.
Putting divisions on trade aside and presenting a united front. After months of intense negotiations, Beijing signalled it was willing to open up its economy to companies from Europe. European firms will also no longer be forced to share their technological know-how to gain a foothold in China, a long-time demand from the bloc.
I also welcome the explicit agreement that there should be no forced transfer of technologies as a price for investment. As we work in the global level, we also want to move more together bilaterally. Our cooperation simply makes sense for both sides.
The pledges from Beijing come just weeks after the French president said there needed to be a coordinated European approach in dealing with China. And while both sides acknowledge they are in competition, they want to work in a multilateral environment.
The two sides reaffirm their joint commitment to cooperate on WTO reform to ensure its continued relevance and allow it to address global trade challenges.
The declaration in Brussels comes as both the EU and China are engaged in trade negotiations with the United States. While Washington and Beijing are reportedly close to striking a deal, the EU has once again come into the crosshairs of the US president. On Monday, he threatened to slap tariffs on $11 billion of European exports to the United States.
Now, the renewed threat of tariffs plus a gloomy outlook from the International Monetary Fund have weighed down global trade this Tuesday. Airbus shares dropped about 2%, while drinks and car and plane parts manufacturers dropped across Europe. The DAX down nearly 1% at the close. Wall Street also closed lower, the Dow Jones shedding about 180 points by the closing bell. Investors fairly pessimistic about the trade outlook, as well as earnings season, which kicks off later this week, with major banks set to report their first quarter profits. Of course, we'll have that and all the rest of the business news throughout the week, Mark.
As I would expect. Kate, thank you very much indeed. Great to see you. Kate there with all the business. Nice to look there at what's happening in Israel. Of course, I imagine lots of people there waiting to see where it goes. Stocks and shares might go like that, but clearly big issues at stake in Israel. And thank you for reflecting the situation. We continue our special look at the Israeli elections. James Creedon joins us for, well, his own Media Watch take on what's happening, but also we'll look at what's happening online.
Yes.
Israel-wise.
That's right. Too close to call, as the old athlete expression would have it.
It's true, though.
And it is. And that's the headlines on most of the Israeli news websites that are covering this election evening. You can see it there on haaretz.com. Gantz and Netanyahu tied, no clear path to premiership for either. Just a quick whip through some of the journalists and others tweeting about this on Twitter, obviously enough. The hopes of Netanyahu's opponents now hinge on Channel 12, which gave Gantz a 4-seat advantage, 60-60 tie in the blocks. In the exit polls of Channel 11 and 13, Netanyahu is the next Prime Minister. So basically, three channels, exit polls across the three. Channel 12 gives one set of result, gives one side the victor, and 11 and 13 says it's Netanyahu.
Who can trust the journalists? That's the question.
There you go.
Trust us. We're trying to give you the best we can.
We're just telling you, don't trust the others. Absolute euphoria here at Blue White headquarters. Only Channel 12 results posted, though. So euphoria based on what channel you're looking at, right? Because if you're looking at the other channel, you'd be somewhat less euphoric.
I wonder if these channels have a vested interest at all. It's, maybe they might lean a certain way. In
any case, Gantz and Yair Lapid, they were proclaiming victory. The Israeli public has had their say. They know it's but as Anshel Pfeffer here of Haaretz said, says they know it's premature and they know that the exit polls can turn around and that they're cashing in basically while they can. Meanwhile, Benjamin Netanyahu doing exactly the same thing. And basically he said, we've won a definite victory. Well, actually, depending on what. You haven't.
Depends how you count it, doesn't it, I suppose?
I thank the citizens of Israel for their trust, and I will start by assembling a government with our natural partners tonight. He might be getting ahead of himself a bit there. John Linden, who is the EU director of Al-MEP, that's the Alliance for Middle East Peace. It's an organisation of about 100 different... Yep. Remember, he says, the exit polls only record votes counted up until 8 p.m. In 2015, around 30% of all voters cast their ballots in the last 2 hours. That's nearly 11 Knesset seats.
That's a good insight, isn't it?
There you go. I mean,
that's the Linden.
That basically circles back to the headline. We don't know. We'll have to wait and see.
Indeed.
Now, a couple more points on this election. Social media was being used considerably by candidates such as Netanyahu on election day. Now, we all know that you're not really meant to be going on TV or be interviewed by the networks on election day. Social media has allowed candidates to sort of get around those laws, but it is testing the limits of those laws governing electioneering. You did see Benjamin Netanyahu at the beach, for example. It is a public holiday in Israel, and there he is with a microphone in hand, knowing very well that he has up to 6 million people following him on various social media platforms. So, it's certainly a way of getting around those laws which actually don't allow for campaigning as the election nears in the final 24 hours. So he basically was telling people, get off the beach. You shouldn't be enjoying the sunshine until you've gone to the polls, which was done in a jovial, jocular way, but it's also quite, he means it. And meanwhile, this was an interesting one. The poor man who fell off his motorbike, but a man fell off his motorbike, and this was on an auto Route 4. And who was there on the scene? Only Mr. Gantz, and he tended to the gentleman in question who had sustained some injuries until the medical services came along, which led to some headlines such as this, which I suppose you can't complain about on election day. What was it again? It appears to have gone now, but it was... hold on, I need to get this right.
Yeah.
It said... scrolling up.
Gantz to the rescue on election day.
That's a nice headline. But
because it's news, so therefore
right.
He's in it, and he could actually be taking his campaigning as well. But
obviously
he's using his military training. He's a former soldier, isn't he?
That's right. He happened upon this, was the first, went over, attended to the guy while the medical people were coming along. So it was quite a heroic thing, and it did lead to heroics in the headlines.
He did the right thing, and that's good.
Absolutely, he certainly did. You can't argue with that. In any case, another big item that was buzzing today was hidden security cameras. Now, these were found on certain right-wing campaigners, supporters allegedly of the Likud party, who were hanging around polling stations in certain Arab neighbourhoods. Now, the theory here, or at least, it's not even a theory, a right-wing source told Haaretz newspaper that the move was aimed to preserve the purity of the election and to assure that the Arab party Ram Balad won't pass the electoral threshold through falsifications. So essentially, Likud campaigners were equipped with these cameras because there was a lack of trust in terms of the probity of I suppose counting of votes in that in those campaign centres. There you go. There are the cameras. A lot of people talking about it, and it was that was illegal basically.
But it doesn't stop people doing it, and that's one of the issues about social networking and the internet and the fact that anybody can afford a camera and they're all in these phones and everyone can do that, that it's pushing the boundaries of everything, it seems, these days, isn't it? James, thank you.
Thanks,
Kate, thank you very much to Media Watch Business. It's all happening. We're analysing the Israeli elections. Netanyahu and Gantz, they both say they've won. Stay with us. We're analysing that and looking at what happens next. This is live from Paris.
France 24. Every art form.
Italy but died here in the Loire Valley. This week, France in Focus tells you all about the final years of visionary artist and inventor Leonardo da Vinci.
France in Focus, presented by Nadia Charby on France 24 and France24.com.
Welcome back to Live from Paris. I'm Mark Owen. These are the headlines. Israel decides. Early exit polls say that Benny Gantz may have pulled off something of a surprise. His centrist Blue and White Alliance predicted to have more seats than Benjamin Netanyahu's party, though the city Prime Minister Netanyahu is claiming what he calls, quote, a clear election victory for the right-wing bloc led by his party Likud. The latest we have from the Palestinian side, a senior Palestinian negotiator saying Israel has voted no to peace. Theresa May's visit to Paris, a bid by the British Prime Minister to get the French President Emmanuel Macron on side for a Brexit extension. What it won't be beyond the bees is for them to know, but we know that April the 12th is fast approaching, and with it the risk of a no-deal doomsday scenario. The word from Washington, even the Trump administration is bracing for a no-deal Brexit. Algeria has an interim president, but it's the man that demonstrators have long been shouting that they don't want. They see Abdelkader Ben Salah as essentially an extension of the clan of Abdelaziz Bouteflika. Thank you very much for joining us. We're analysing, of course, the words, the result, the news as it's coming in from Israel where the election has taken place. Polls are saying that it's really too close to call at the moment, with Benny Gantz perhaps a shade ahead of Benjamin Netanyahu, which some people kind of say they were predicting, but 2 hours ago no one was telling me that kind of thing in our office. So it looks like some kind of an upset is happening. Douglas Herbert's our foreign affairs commentator, international affairs commentator.
Yeah,
that's the correct title, isn't it?
It's the correct.
And we're looking for comment here,
Doug,
about what's happening, because it's quite a unique situation right now.
It's unique, and I think it's still safe at this hour mark. We still have to use the terms neck and neck. Let's stay with the cliches for now. Close race, whatever you want to say, razor thin margin. Because these exit polls, it's not that they're totally wrong, and it's not that they're totally unreliable. Obviously, they give indications, sometimes strong indications. But as we saw earlier in the media watch, often a lot of the votes are counted later. The exit polls only indicate voting up until a certain time. It's a little bit premature to start drawing broad brushstroke conclusions. But you're right, we could start to look at trends a little bit here. One of the things that jumps out is that this was obviously a race against two personalities. It was never an election really about issues. There were no debates in this election, and if there was any debate, it was really all just about security. It was about the security of the Israelis. The election really showed the degree to which Israeli society over the past decade, 15 years or so, has lurched much more to the right. That emphasis on security does show that to a large extent. One of the things that's interesting, though, is that Benjamin Netanyahu has been, love him or loathe him, a lot of people will recognize he's been a very savvy diplomat. He has definitely cut a rather, strong figure on the world stage, being able to showcase himself alongside world leaders, forming, obviously, that alliance with Donald Trump, very, very close allies there. But you might look at all of this and say, well, why didn't he score a more decisive victory tonight? Given the fact that he has pitched himself to the world as the only man who essentially, the only politician who can really protect Israelis, the only politician who has mastered the art of diplomacy on the world stage, can pick up the phone and call people like Donald Trump. Why wasn't it more decisive? And there you get to the heart of the real issue behind this campaign, which is the polarization of society. Obviously, yes, Netanyahu faced a lot of big challenges, not least of which were 3 separate corruption probes and possible indictments looming over him, which he had to sort of swat away throughout the election. But that said, given his dominance on the Israeli political stage and given his own self-definition as the protector, the guarantor of Israel's stability, you might back away and you might look at those results and say, wow, the fact it is so neck and neck, that really is an indication that there is a large segment of Israeli society that has rejected Netanyahu and has chosen another candidate. And let's not forget that Benny Gantz, even though former Israeli army chief of staff, the guy who was able to pitch himself as just as solid on security as Netanyahu, he was fresh to politics. He formed his party back in February. This was a newcomer to the political stage. So you might say, depending on where you're coming from, it's impressive what he did in such a short time. You might just say it's a function of the fact that a lot of people were rejecting. This was a referendum on Benjamin Netanyahu, and a lot of this vote reflected that, a rejection of the singular personality of Benjamin Netanyahu.
And, of course, what happens now is that the smaller parties will play that role of kingmaker, as we like to say in these analyses. It's all about coalitions. It's all about making those deals, isn't it? And that's probably why Netanyahu is saying that he's won a clear victory. He's seeing that
the momentum.
The parties on the right will say, OK, let's get him with Bibi, as he likes to call himself, and away they go, and he gets him for his fifth term and makes history.
Right?
Yeah.
It's out of the starting blocks, right? The results come in. Don't start analyzing them. Don't start crunching those numbers too much. Get the momentum going. Start picking up the phones. Start putting yourself in that victorious, that triumphal posture. But what's interesting here is you're absolutely right. The coalition, these small parties, and in Netanyahu's case in the bloc, what has it been? It's been far-right, more extreme parties, and the ultra-Orthodox, the religious parties. There are 5 of those parties, of those small parties. On the left, how many of those smaller parties are there? 2. So a lot of people look at these and say, well, Benjamin Netanyahu, perhaps even if he has fewer seats in his own party, Likud, he has an easier path to building a possible coalition because there are more parties on the far right or of religious inclination that are more inclined to form a coalition with him. Some of them would never form a coalition with the Benny Gantzes of this world. So that's what a lot of these analysts are looking at right now. And the real question you have to ask yourself, and that will come out in the hours ahead as the official results come, Mark, is how many of those small parties have gotten past the parliamentary threshold, 3.25%, in order to get the seats in parliament. Because if they don't get past that threshold, they don't count. They can't be part of a coalition. So that's something to watch. How many of those small parties will get into parliament and will be viable building blocks in a potential coalition?
Douglas, thank you very much indeed. Let's continue with the analysis and bring in live from Tel Aviv, Emmanuel Navon, who's Professor of Political Science in Tel Aviv. Good evening to you, sir. And fellow at the Coalet Policy Forum. Thank you for joining us here on France 24, France 24 in English. Are you surprised at the situation that is happening now, where you are in Israel? Do you think this is a rejection of Benjamin Netanyahu and what he stands for?
Well, I think that first of all, the results are temporary. These results will have to wait until tomorrow. But based on the estimation that we have at this point, I think it's very clear that Benny Gantz got really a very large support in Israeli society. The result of being ahead of Likud, it's probably the first time. I mean, it is the first time since 2009 that a political party in Israel has been ahead of Likud. Last time was in 2009 when the centrist Kadima party had 1 extra seat but was not able to form a coalition. The question is today, is it going to be a similar situation? The answer is that if the blue and white party of Benny Gantz has a large gap with Likud of 4 to 5 seats, so there will be a psychological effect, and the president will have to consider asking Benny Gantz to form a coalition. But then again, a lot will depend on the small parties that might not pass the threshold of 3.25%. So to summarize, I think that, yes, the results tonight are pretty surprising because they're very different from what the polls were saying in terms of the small party. For example, the party of Moshe Feiglin, but also of Naftali Bennett, were credited by most polls of really having 6, 7, or 8 seats, and apparently they're not even passing the threshold.
I have 2 questions for you. Do you think Benny Gantz has a possibility of becoming Prime Minister? And if he does, will people in Israel notice any real difference between what he wants to do and what Netanyahu might have wanted to do?
So Benny Gantz's chances of forming a coalition depend on 2 things. A, will he really have this major gap with Likud? Will he be ahead of Likud of 1 seat or 4 or 5? B, will some of the center-right parties recommend him as prime minister? For example, the party of Avigdor Lieberman or the party of Moshe Kahlon. These parties are more naturally with Likud, but they might just recommend Benny Gantz. And in that case, he might have a coalition. Another theoretical possibility would be a unity government between the Likud and Benny Gantz, but that is unlikely. In terms of policy, there are not major policy differences between Benny Gantz and Netanyahu, but, and this is an important point, Benny Gantz really has been running on a platform of having a less toxic and divisive attitude, political behavior, of maintaining unity of the Israeli society. Netanyahu has, with his right-wing partners, is on a path of making reforms in the judicial system, trying to limit the powers of the Supreme Court. Benny Gantz would not do that. So the differences would be less in terms of security or international relations, and more with regard to political institutions in Israel and the power of the Supreme Court. And the last point, of course, is with this much awaited plan of the century or deal of the century of Donald Trump, Benny Gantz would be more likely to consider compromises than Netanyahu with a right-wing coalition.
Emmanuel Navon, Professor of Political Science at Tel Aviv and Fellow of the Coelet Policy Forum. Thank you, sir, very much for sharing your analysis with us here on France 24 English. I really do appreciate your time. Thanks to Douglas, too, Douglas Herbert, our international affairs commentator, who has accompanied me throughout this analysis of what's happening in Israel. Of course, the elections just working their way through. The results are basically too close to call. We're not exaggerating. Opinion polls, exit polls, giving an advantage, it seems, to Benny Gantz. However, Benjamin Netanyahu is saying that with his ability to make a deal, he thinks he's won the day. So obviously we're looking for all developments as they come, and our team is out there. We'll be joining them very shortly.